Hello everyone, and welcome back for Chapter 2 of Biology for Majors. The topic of this chapter is going to be the chemical foundation of life, and we are going to study a little bit of basic chemistry, which will allow us to better appreciate some of the biological principles regarding cell composition and cell function that we're going to be talking about later on. Now, the word chemistry might make you recoil just a little bit, but a couple of things to kind of take your mind off of that just a little bit. We're not going to get into what I might call any hardcore chemistry, but we are going to see here that we do need to have kind of a rudimentary appreciation for chemistry and how molecules are put together. Because like I said before, we really need that in order to appreciate how cells function, given some of the conversations we had in Chapter 1 about how cells are made of macromolecules, macromolecules are made of regular molecules, and molecules are made of atoms. So we are going to explore some of those relationships a little bit more closely here. Okay, so just a little bit of kind of big picture real world context here. I want to talk just a little bit about something that happened in fairly recent history within the past decade or so. The Curiosity rover, which was a mission launched by NASA to search for evidence of life on Mars. So just to give you a little bit of context here, really ultimately what we're going to be talking about in this chapter is kind of the difference in chemical composition for living matter versus non-living matter. What is it about the chemical and atomic composition of living matter that's different from non-living matter, like the desk that you're sitting at, or your computer, or the water that you're drinking? So we have a conception after reviewing Chapter 1 of some things are alive and some things are not alive, right? So we're really going to start learning that there are certain chemical elements like carbon and hydrogen and oxygen that tend to be found in much greater proportions in living matter when you compare it to non-living matter. So even if you come to the conclusion that your cells and your body are made of atoms just like your table is made of atoms, we'll find that they are made of different kinds of atoms. So if we go ahead and define the word matter, that just refers to any substance that has mass and has volume. So if it has a measurable mass and then takes up some amount of space, then it is matter, even if it's living or non-living. So a little bit more on the Curiosity rover. You can see a picture of it here. It was launched from Earth and sent to Mars. You can imagine it probably took quite a while for it to arrive at Mars. But once it landed, its mission was to drive around and use a strong laser beam to vaporize rocks and soils and then sample that vaporized material to analyze the elemental composition so that we can start looking for evidence of life on Mars. So basically the idea is that if the rover was able to discover even trace amounts of things like carbon or hydrogen or oxygen in the rocks, then that could potentially be evidence of, well, since we know that living matter tends to be made of these types of atoms, then maybe at one point, maybe there was life on Mars. Maybe there was even the presence of water on Mars. And we will, later in this chapter, discuss how important water is to life, even if water is not strictly living matter itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and introduce some new terminology here. All matter in the universe is composed of atoms of a variety of different elements. So we saw the word atom pop up in Chapter 1, and we said that atoms are basically the simplest building block for all living material. So atoms, then molecules, then macromolecules, and then cells, and so on. So hopefully you remember that at this point. Matter comes in 3 different phases: solid, liquid, and gas. You're probably already pretty aware of that. The one thing here we have not really defined before is an element. So an element is a substance that cannot be separated into different substances with different chemical properties. So an element is only going to be made of one kind of atom. Water, for example, is not an element because it is made of 2 types of atoms: hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. Glucose is not an element because it's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Now, Carbon, like that you find in diamonds or coal, that is an element because the only type of atom present are carbon atoms. So it's important to know the difference there. So atoms can exist on their own as individual units of a particular element, like the carbon that you find in coal, or more commonly, you can find atoms as part of a larger molecule or compound, and in those you will find those atoms molecularly bonded to each other. And we will discuss later on in this chapter different types of chemical bonds. I mentioned this on the previous slide, but living and non-living matter, they're both made of atoms, so we have that in common, but living and non-living matter tend to be very different in terms of which elements tend to be used. And a good mnemonic device to remember here is CHNOPS, C-H-N-O-P-S. Those are, in general terms, the 6 major elements that tend to be overrepresented in living matter when you compare it to non-living matter. So living matter tends to contain a lot of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Non-living matter, not so much, with one exception being oxygen, but I will show you that on the next slide. So, having a little bit of trouble with getting that last sentence to show up. It keeps popping over to the next slide. I'm trying to figure out what it says here. So basically what that statement says at the bottom there that we're kind of missing out on is that atoms are really, really, really small. They're so small that we can't even see them with a microscope, but the reason why we're able to discuss what atoms look like and what they're made of and how they behave is that we have done a number of careful experiments over the past century or two that have led us to understand a lot about how atoms work and what they look like and how they function, so we don't have to worry about that even though we can't really see them. So here's that graph that I was mentioning. So this is showing you a distribution of the different types of elements that are found in living matter in red and non-living matter in blue. So it's organism, tissue versus the Earth's crust. So you can definitely see in red here, living matter contains carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, a lot of oxygen, phosphorus and sulfur, not nearly as much, but you can see that phosphorus and sulfur really aren't found that much in non-living matter. And then for living matter, you can see some other things like potassium and calcium, a little bit of iron in our blood, magnesium, sodium, and so on. And then if you compare that to non-living matter, you can see a lot of things like iron and calcium and minerals like potassium, silicon. You don't really find any silicon at all in living matter, but you find a lot of it in sand and rocks and things like that. The only real overlap that we can see here is oxygen. So you will find in the Earth's crust a lot of metal oxides. So oxygen is really the only exception to the rule that we laid down before. Okay, so let's talk about atomic structure and function. So we said before that an atom, by its definition, really cannot be broken down into smaller and simpler units. That's why it was the bottom rung in the levels of organization that we talked about in Chapter 1. But with that being said, the atom does contain a number of smaller units, which are called subatomic particles. We can't break an atom and isolate these particles, but those particles are there. So these subatomic particles do have their own properties that are going to help contribute to the whole function of the atom at large. So there are 3 different types of subatomic particles. The first one we will focus on is called the proton. Protons have a positive electrical charge. So electrical charge is something that we're going to be talking about a lot in this chapter. Protons are positively charged particles, and they reside in the center hub of the atom, which is called the nucleus. So we will learn here that the number of protons an atom has defines what element that atom happens to be. So for example, we will see that every atom of hydrogen has 1 proton. Every atom of oxygen has 8 protons. Every atom of carbon has 6 protons, and so on and so forth. So the number of protons an atom has is all you need to be able to tell what kind of element you are dealing with. So the number of protons the atom has not only defines the element, but gets recorded as that element's atomic number. So the atomic number for an element is, or for an atom, is all you need to know regarding what element that atom belongs to. The next type of subatomic particle is the neutron. Given the name, it is electrically neutral, so it does not have an electrical charge, but it also resides in the nucleus with the proton. So if you look over here at oxygen's nucleus here, you can see the nucleus is made up of a big cluster of both protons and neutrons. So the nucleus for oxygen, for this oxygen atom, contains a total of 16 subatomic particles, 8 protons and 8 neutrons. And I am running into some problems with the way the animations are working here. So that last statement got skipped over again. I'm not sure what that's about. But the last subatomic particle is the electron. And the electron is not found inside the nucleus, but rather the electrons orbit around a kind of nebulous area around the nucleus called the electron cloud or the electron shells. The other notable thing about electrons is that they have a negative electrical charge. So for most atoms, so for most electrically neutral atoms, you will usually expect them to have an equal number of protons and an equal number of electrons. So in this case, oxygen here has 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and 8 electrons. The 8 positive protons and the 8 negative electrons cancel each other out, so the whole atom is totally electrically neutral at that point. So here is a figure that will kind of summarize all the important information about these 3 types of subatomic particles. So the 3 main things we want to know about any subatomic particle is its electrical charge. So we said that protons are a +1, electrons are a -1, and then neutrons have no electrical charge. We covered the location where protons and neutrons are both found inside this central nucleus, and then the electrons orbit around in not exactly a ring, but if you want to think of it as kind of an orbital ring, that works too. So it orbits around the nucleus in the electron cloud. The one thing we have not covered regarding these subatomic particles is their mass. So we use this term called atomic mass unit, or AMU. So 1 AMU is defined as 1.67 times 10 to the -27th kilograms. A human, on average, is going to weigh about 50 to 60 kilograms. So this is a much smaller number. So these subatomic particles have nearly incalculably small masses. These things are very, very, very light. So it turns out that protons and neutrons weigh or have about the same mass. So we just say they have 1 atomic mass unit worth of mass. Now, if you look down here for electrons, it says 0. So what you would glean from that is that electrons have no mass, and that is not strictly true. Okay, so every type of matter in this universe has mass. What we can take from this is not that electrons do not have mass, it's just that they have such little mass compared to their proton and neutron counterparts that we make a mathematical assumption that they have no mass. So basically they are so light that they don't really matter too much. They do have a small amount of mass. Electron mass is about 9.1 times 10 to the -31st kilograms, so several thousand times lighter than a proton or a neutron, but electrons do have mass even if that mass is mathematically negligible. So basically, if you want a menu of all the potential elements that we can use to build matter in the known universe, we use what is called the periodic table of the elements, which you can see here. So all of the known elements in the universe are organized by their atomic number. So you can actually see hydrogen here with an atomic number of 1, which means it has 1 proton up here in the top left. And then the way the organization goes is from left to right. So we skip all the way over to the right side for helium with an atomic number of 2. And then we start going down and then working our way left to right, down, left to right, down, left to right. So lithium 3, beryllium 4, boron 5, carbon 6, and so on and so forth. And you can actually see we end up with elements as high as an atomic number of 118, which would indicate that this element here has 118 protons. So even though there is kind of a staggering number of elements here, some of these elements are artificial. So only elements 1 through 92 actually occur naturally on Earth and in the known universe. So 92 would be uranium. So anything beyond 92, you can see they're kind of indicated by italics. Those are artificial elements. They do not occur naturally. One thing we will learn here is that elements that are in the same vertical column actually have a lot of chemical properties in common with each other. So we'll find out later on that these are all elements, these are all atoms that have the same number of valence electrons. So we'll cover this more later on, but valence electrons are how many electrons an atom has in the outermost energy level or outermost shell. But like I said, we will define that better later on. So because of that, hydrogen, lithium, sodium, potassium, and so on will actually have quite a lot in common with each other. Fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine, and so on will have a lot in common with each other. Carbon, silicon, germanium, and tin will have a lot in common with each other as well. Okay, so let's take a look at atomic mass and mass number. So first of all, each kind of element, if you go back and look at the periodic table, each kind of element is represented by either a 1-letter or 2-letter symbol. So for example, hydrogen is H, sodium is Na, carbon is C, potassium is K, oxygen is O, and iron is Fe. The first thing that you should go ahead and register with yourself is that not every element is going to have a symbol that matches its first or first 2 letters. So that is the case for hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, but sodium does not go by the symbol S or SO. Potassium does not go by the symbol P or PO. Iron does not go by the symbol I or IR. So just don't let yourself think that every element is going to have an easily identifiable symbol. So we've already covered that the atomic number for each element is what defines the element and tells you exactly how many protons that an atom of that element has. So every atom of carbon, for example, that has an atomic number of 6, every atom of carbon is guaranteed to have 6 protons, but that is all the atomic number tells you. The mass number, on the other hand, for any given atom is going to be equal to the sum of the number of protons that atom has and the number of neutrons that atom has as well. So if you look at carbon down here, carbon has an atomic number of 6, which we already established tells us that carbon has 6 protons. But if carbon's mass number is 12, then that tells us how many protons plus neutrons carbon has. So if we want to just figure out how many neutrons this atom has, all we have to do is a little bit of subtraction. We take the mass number of 12, subtract the atomic number of 6, and we can figure out that this particular atom of carbon has 6 neutrons. So if we check our math one more time, 6 protons plus 6 neutrons gives us the mass number of 12. Now the question becomes, why do we not consider the number of electrons? So if the mass number is basically telling us how much mass an atom has in terms of number of AMUs, why do we not consider electrons? Well, remember back a couple of slides, we said that even though electrons do have a very small amount of mass, that mass is so small it doesn't really register in comparison to protons and neutrons. So again, we make a mathematical assumption that that mass is 0 even though it really is not. So electrons are not considered when you are calculating the mass number of an atom. Now, to throw a wrench into this, something separate from the mass number for a particular atom is the atomic mass of the element at large. So we need to kind of talk this through. Mass number is something that is specific to one particular atom of an element. Atomic mass is descriptive of the element at large. So an element's defined atomic mass, for example, if we talk about carbon, the element carbon has an atomic mass of 12.01. So the question becomes, even though those numbers are very close, why is the atomic mass of carbon not equal to the mass number of this being the most common type of atom of carbon that we can find? So to understand this, we need to talk about something called isotopes. An isotope is a variance of an atom that all have the same atomic number, so they all have the same number of protons, but they are different from each other because they have different numbers of neutrons. So this is going to cause different atoms of the same element to have different mass numbers, even though they all have the same number of protons. So first, consider these three isotopes of carbon. This is called carbon-12. This is the most common type of carbon that we looked at on the previous slide. Carbon-12 has a mass number of 12, meaning it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-13 has a mass number of 13, so the number of protons is the same, but this carbon actually has 7 neutrons instead of the 6 we saw before. And then carbon-14 actually has 8 neutrons. So each one of these atoms, even though they are different from each other, they are all carbon because they all have 6 protons, but they are different kinds of atoms because they differ in terms of the number of neutrons they have. Let's do the same thing for the 3 isotopes of hydrogen. The most common kind of hydrogen atom is called protium, or hydrogen-1. Hydrogen-1 does not have any neutrons. It is literally just 1 proton and 1 electron. Deuterium, or hydrogen-2, has 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 electron. And then tritium, which is hydrogen-3, has 1 proton, 2 neutrons, and 1 electron. So you can see in both the cases of carbon and hydrogen, we have 3 different types of isotopes, and literally the only thing they have different compared to each other is the number of neutrons they have. So the interesting thing about isotopes is that as atoms become heavier and heavier, meaning that as atoms start taking on more and more neutrons, atoms tend to become unstable. When you're dealing with particularly heavy isotopes, meaning the ones that have the greatest number of neutrons, they tend to spontaneously decay. And those are what we call radioisotopes because they tend to give off detectable radiation. So before we move on to the application of radioisotopes, just make sure that you understand every isotope of carbon contains 6 protons. Every isotope of hydrogen contains 1 proton. So for any given element, you're not going to change the number of protons because that's what defines the element. But you can change the number of neutrons. So radioisotopes actually have a lot of useful applications in medicine. In the above part of the diagram, you are looking at a thyroid scan. The thyroid is a hormone-producing gland in the human body and the body of other mammals that produces hormones that help to regulate our metabolisms and our chemical reactions that happen in our cells. But it turns out the cells of the thyroid are just about the only cells in the whole body that accumulate the element iodine. So if we suspect that someone's thyroid is not behaving properly, we can actually take a pretty good picture of the thyroid by injecting the patient with a radioisotope called iodine 131. So this is one of the heaviest forms of iodine, and it gives off radioactivity. So because thyroid cells accumulate iodine and none of the other cells in the body do, after a little while, after injecting the patient, their thyroid should become radioactive, and you should be able to detect that and take a picture of it. In the bottom part of the diagram, you can see a patient that was injected with glucose, which is a sugar molecule, and that glucose incorporates atoms of carbon-14, which is a radioisotope of carbon. So the glucose that gets injected into this patient is radioactive, and a lot of that glucose is going to accumulate in the brain. So you can actually get a really good metabolic profile and picture of the brain in that regard. So if you ever move on to human physiology in your study of science, then you might learn a little bit more about this technique, which is called a PET scan. It involves injecting a patient with a radioisotope or some other type of tracer, and then visualizing cells and structures in the body by taking advantage of the emitted radioactivity. So one last thing to talk about with isotopes. Why is it that for carbon, the atomic mass is 12.01, whereas the mass number for carbon-12 is 12, it's 13 for carbon-13, and 14 for carbon-14. So how do we arrive at that atomic mass of 12.01? Well, the atomic mass is basically the average mass of a carbon atom that is found in nature, okay? So what you might be thinking is that, okay, well, if we have carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14, and we want to know the average mass of carbon, you would think it would just be 13, because 13 is halfway between 12 and 14. But that would assume that carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14 are all found in equal amounts and equal proportions in nature, and that's just not true. Carbon-12 actually makes up almost 99% of all naturally occurring carbon. It is by far the most common type of carbon atom that you can find. Most of the remaining 1.1% is carbon-13, and then carbon-14 is excruciatingly rare, although it does exist to a very small degree. So if we're coming up with an average mass of a carbon atom, we need to take what is called a weighted average. We need to consider that carbon-12 is a lot more common than carbon-13 or carbon-14. So basically the idea here is that if you scooped up 1 billion carbon atoms, 98.9% of them would weigh 12 AMUs, 1.1% of them would weigh 13 AMUs, and then a very, very small percentage of them would weigh 14 AMUs. So if we average those billion carbon atoms together, the average mass of those billion carbon atoms would be about 12.01 AMUs. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to discuss in this section of Chapter 2 is electrons and energy levels. So we need to have this conversation because electrons, like we said before, are not contained within the atom's nucleus. Rather, they are circulating around the nucleus in what we call electron shells or the electron cloud. One of the issues here is that because the electrons are negatively charged, they are going to be attracted to the positively charged nucleus. Remember that positive charge comes from the protons that are in the nucleus. So to prevent the electrons collapsing down on top of the nucleus, the atom has a certain amount of energy associated with it, and that energy is required to hold the electrons in place to make sure that they don't go too close towards the nucleus. Electrons are organized into successive energy levels or energy shells. This is basically a system of organization in which these shells are organized further and further and further away from the nucleus into positions called orbitals, which are basically just a 3D representation of where the electrons are most likely to be found. Now, I will go ahead and kind of take a sidebar here. Any further mention of orbitals in your textbook, you do not need to worry about. I do not hold you responsible for knowing the different types of orbitals, which can be a little bit complicated to deal with. So we are exclusively going to be talking about the energy levels. We're not going to be talking about S, P, D, or F orbitals. So do not worry about those. So since we are focusing just on the energy levels starting with the lowest energy level, which is closest to the nucleus, these energy levels are going to be filled with electrons in order from the lowest energy level to the highest energy level. We have to fill the lowest energy level first before we can start placing electrons into the second energy level. We have to fill the second level before we can start filling the third, and so on and so forth. So there are some rules that dictate how these energy levels get filled up. The first energy level is relatively small, and it can only hold a total of 2 electrons. The second energy level can hold up to 8, and so can the third energy level. The fourth energy level can actually hold more than 8, but what we're going to find is that in biology, we're really only going to be talking about the first 20 elements, which ends at calcium. So for all the most biologically relevant elements, we can stick to the rules as dictated here. The greatest number of energy levels we are ever going to need is 4 for calcium, but we're not going to completely fill that energy level. So as long as you can remember the first level holds 2 and the second and third levels hold 8, you should be good to go. Now, the reason why we care about all this is that organizing electrons into energy levels is going to be important to know, because ultimately the number of electrons an atom has will help to tell us a lot about that atom's chemical properties and its willingness to participate in chemical reactions. Particularly, we are going to be interested for any given atom, we are going to be interested in how many electrons are in the outermost energy level, which we call the valence electrons, the valence shell. So in this diagram, you can actually see a system of visualizing electron organization, which is called the Bohr model of atoms. So basically, if we kind of look at some of the examples here, hydrogen, which only has 1 electron, is only going to have 1 electron shell or 1 energy level, because since that first energy level holds 2 electrons, and since hydrogen only has 1 electron, we do not need more than 1 energy level to contain that 1 electron. Carbon has 6 electrons, so just 1 energy level is not going to cut it. We can put 2 electrons into that first energy level, but the remaining 4 electrons have to go in a second energy level. The same goes for nitrogen, which has 7 electrons total. 2 goes in the first level, the remaining 5 go in the second level. For oxygen that has 8 electrons, the outermost energy level would have 6 electrons. Phosphorus, which has 15 electrons, requires a total of 3 energy levels. If you start with the 15 electrons, the first 2 go in the first energy level, which means we have 13 left over. The second energy level can only hold a total of 8, so after we put 8 there, we have successfully placed 10 electrons, which means the remaining 5 have to go in the third energy level. And the same applies to sulfur, which has 16 electrons total. 2 go in the first energy level, 8 go in the second, and then 6 go in the third. So that outermost energy level, whatever it is called the valence shell, and the electrons in that outermost energy level are called valence electrons. And this is the most important thing for us to consider when we're talking about an atom and its electrons. So whichever energy level is the outermost for that atom, that is what we call the valence shell. So if you look at all these different elements here, we're looking at hydrogen, helium, lithium, carbon, fluorine, neon, sodium, silicon, chlorine, and argon. The energy level that is colored in red is the valence energy level. It's the valence shell. For hydrogen and helium, because the first energy level is the only energy level, that makes it the valence shell. Hydrogen here has 1 valence electron because that's the only electron it has. Helium has 2 valence electrons because it does not need a second energy level. Lithium, though, has 3 total electrons, so the first 2 goes in the first energy level, and that leaves the remaining 1 electron in its valence shell. So lithium would have 1 valence electron. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, fluorine has 7 valence electrons, and neon has a total of 8 in its valence shell as well. So any of the energy levels that we've talked about before, whether it's the first, second, third, or fourth, can potentially be the valence shell, but you have to consider how many energy levels are necessary to house all of the electrons of that given element. If a valence shell is not necessary, if an energy level is not necessary, then it is not the valence shell. Whichever is the outermost shell that does contain electrons, that is your valence shell. A couple of things to take note of here. If you look at how the periodic table is organized, where hydrogen is on top of lithium, which is on top of sodium, you'll notice that hydrogen, lithium, and sodium all have one valence electron, and that's why these three elements actually have a lot in common with each other. Carbon and silicon have a lot in common with each other because they both have 4 valence electrons. Fluorine and chlorine both have a lot in common with each other because they both have 7 valence electrons. And then helium, neon, and argon, which belong to a group of elements called the noble gases, they all have full outer shells. Helium has 2, and neon and argon all have 8, but they are very similar in the sense that their valence shells are completely full of electrons, and more on that later. Excuse me. So basically what we're going to eventually see here when we start talking about the formation of chemical bonds and chemical reactions, atoms are going to be at their happiest or their most stable when their valence shell is full. Atoms don't like it when their valence shell has room to spare. Atoms want to have a full valence shell. So for hydrogen, it has 1 valence electron, but it would really like to have 2 or none at all. Lithium has 1 valence electron, but it would really like to either have 8 or take that 1 electron away to have the first energy level be the valence shell. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, but it would really like to have 8. Fluorine has 7, but it would really like to have 8. But then if you look at the noble gases over here, they already have full valence shells, so they are already very happy. So what you could take from this is that helium, neon, and argon really do not like to participate in chemical reactions because they are already very happy. So one thing that you might want to kind of walk yourself through before you go any further in this lecture is that make sure that you can look at all of these atoms here and not only figure out how many valence electrons they have, but how many electrons would they need to add or subtract in order to have a full valence shell. And you might also consider, is it easier to add electrons or easier to take them away? For lithium, for example, would it be easier to add the 7 valence electrons it's missing or take that 1 away so that then all that's left over is the 2 that are in the first shell? Okay, so the last thing for this section, and this has been kind of a long video, so thanks for hanging in with me here. The last thing that we'll kind of mention here as a preamble to future discussions on chemical reactions is that on the previous slide we saw that the outermost shell, whichever it is what we call the valence shell. And those electrons that are there in that valence shell are your valence electrons. Now, one thing that can happen is that electrons in the valence shell can be transferred from one atom to another. So if you get 2 atoms together and one atom has 1 valence electron that it doesn't really want, and the other atom has 7 valence electrons and it wants just 1 more, you can actually come up with a mutually beneficial arrangement for those 2 atoms where 1 valence electron is transferred from one atom to another. So these are called reduction, oxidation, or redox reactions when you deal with the complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another. The atom that gains the electron is said to be reduced. Now that might sound strange because when you think of reduce, you think of something that is lost. But the word reduction here, so for the atom that gains this electron, it is reduced in the sense that it has gained a -1 charge. So that is where the reduction term comes in there. The atom that lost the electron is therefore said to be oxidized. So oxidation for losing electrons and reduction for gaining electrons. What we're eventually going to see here is that this transfer of electrons between 2 electrically neutral atoms, this is going to cause both of the atoms to now have an imbalance between their number of protons and electrons. So one of those one of those atoms, the one that becomes oxidized, is now going to be positively charged on the whole, because if it lost one electron, it now has one more proton than it does electrons. And the atom that becomes reduced, it is now going to have an overall negative charge because it now has one more electron than it does protons. So the term we use for these atoms that have electrical charges is we call them ions. A cation is what we call a positively charged ion, and an anion is what we call a negatively charged ion. So in this diagram, the atom that becomes oxidized and loses its electron is going to become a cation, and the atom that became reduced and gained an electron is going to become an anion. Okay, so that is the end of this video discussing the composition of atoms and their subatomic particles. Thank you again for your attention, and join us next time and we will start seeing the payoff on these discussions, particularly those revolving around electrons, and we will start talking about chemical reactions and chemical bonds. Thanks again.